The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above St. Michael's ICU, a sound like electricity learning to sing. Katie Rodriguez moved through the unit at 11:47 p.m., restocking the crash cart with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license, older than her carefully constructed cover, older than the name on her hospital badge. She checked each medication against the slots with a rhythm that belonged in an operating room, or a medevac helicopter, or a combat aid station somewhere in Helmand Province where the dust never settled and the wounded never stopped coming. The antiseptic sting of the unit wrapped around her like it always did. Bleach. Saline. The metallic copper ghost of old blood that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. She didn't flinch at any of it. Katie had learned to metabolize fear, pain, and the lingering smell of human suffering the way other nurses learned to read monitors. The 14-gauge angiocath needles went into their slot. The endotracheal tubes. The epinephrine in neat rows like soldiers at formation. 183 shifts in this uniform. 183 days of keeping her hand steady while Dr. Mercer kept his eyes sharp and his voice cutting, always searching for the moment she would break, would shatter, would confirm his theory that community college nurses were just nurses playing dress-up in scrubs they didn't deserve. He didn't know she'd already broken once. In Bagram. The pieces just hadn't shown. The elevator dinged. The sound arrived before he did, a small mechanical announcement of Dr. Mercer's entrance onto the night shift. Katie's hands didn't pause over the crash cart. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her breathing stayed measured, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer, already buried the people who mattered, already learned that showing the antagonist your fear was the same as handing him a weapon. She felt him before she saw him, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm breaks. The Italian loafers clicked against linoleum like fingernails on glass. Rodriguez, Dr. Mercer said. Not a greeting. A diagnosis. The kind of word a doctor used when he was naming something he'd already decided was infection. She turned from the crash cart, her movements unhurried. When you've run combat protocols under fire, the small theaters of hospital hierarchy shrink into something manageable. Something you can breathe through. Katie met his eyes with the careful blankness of a woman who had learned to show nothing. Doctor. He was 48, Mercer, with the kind of build that came from a gym membership and whatever genetics decided to make a man look perpetually expensive. His scrubs were newer than anyone else's, still holding their dye. He wore them like a three-piece suit. Katie had worked 372 hours under his supervision and had never once seen him touch a patient directly, only point at them, instruct others, stand back and catalogue failures like a debt collector counting interest. Were you assigned to the ICU tonight? He asked. Yes, doctor. Specifically tonight. The question sat between them like a trap with teeth. Katie kept her expression level. She'd answered harder questions than this. She'd answered questions in rooms where the walls didn't have names and the people asking them had stars on their collars. The rotation runs 8 days this cycle. Day 19 falls tonight. Mercer's mouth thinned like someone had pulled a drawstring. He'd expected hesitation. Confusion. The small social fractures that let him wedged out deeper. Katie had learned long ago that competence was what he truly couldn't tolerate, not incompetence, which could be mocked and managed, but the unmistakable presence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It made his authority smaller by comparison. I'll need you restocking the supply closet instead, he said. Night shift needs reorganization on the 3rd floor. She didn't question it. That would be the trap. Questioning his orders was what he wanted. The moment she pushed back, he could frame it as insubordination, lack of respect for the hierarchy, exactly the kind of behavior that proved his point about her background, her lack of training, her fundamental unsuitability for the surgical floor. Katie nodded and moved past him toward the supply closet, her left leg favoring its old injury just enough to require conscious correction, the kind of small compensation that came from IED fragmentation that had healed wrong because there'd been no time to heal it right when you were trying to get 12 other people back to forward operating base alive. Room 347 was on her way. She allowed herself that. A brief stop to check the monitor, to read the chart that hung like a prayer outside the door. The colonel lay in the bed like something carved from granite, dark hair, a face that had survived more than one explosion, the surgical aftermath of an IED blast that had come up through his Humvee 4 months ago in Kandahar province. Pelvic fracture. Extensive tissue damage. The kind of wounds that killed people in 20 minutes if you didn't know how to stop the bleeding, and this man had somehow lived long enough for a medevac, then surgery, then recovery, then the slow calculus of physical therapy that would eventually decide if he'd walk normally again. His eyes opened. They were the color of slate and they focused on her with the immediate clarity of someone trained to catalog threats and advantages in a single glance. Katie held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking back at his vitals. The monitor displayed what she already knew: stable. His oxygen sat at 97%. Heart rate 84. Blood pressure holding. Everything optimal. Everything exactly as it should be for a man whose body was learning to live again. "You need anything, Colonel?" she asked. 10 words. Professional distance. The measured tone of a nurse who was reading a chart, not seeing someone she recognized. "Water," he said. She poured it. Ice chips in a plastic cup with a flexible straw. Set it within his reach on the overbed table. His hand reached for it and stopped. She saw him processing something, some calculation happening behind those slate eyes, some memory trying to surface. But Katie was already moving, already creating distance, already making it impossible for him to find what he was searching for. The supply closet was waiting. The 3rd floor needed reorganization. Dr. Mercer was waiting to see if she would disobey, would push back, would give him the single moment of resistance he needed to justify everything he'd already decided about her. She climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator. The stairwell smelled like concrete and the ghost of cigarette smoke from before the hospital banned it. Her left leg handled the climb with the kind of efficiency that suggested this particular pain was old information, already metabolized into something she lived with rather than something that lived in her. 4th step from the bottom was slightly higher than the others, a fact in her environment she'd already catalogued on the first day of work, the way she catalogued all of them. Exit routes. Personnel patterns. Supply locations. Threat assessments. The habits died hard, even when the war had officially ended for her 18 months ago. The supply closet on 3 was a maze of cardboard boxes and plastic bins that hadn't been organized in what looked like 3 months. Katie worked through it methodically. Tongue depressors in 1 stack. Gauze in ascending size. The surgical gloves arranged by latex and nitrile, by size, by expiration date. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who understood that in an operating room, a nurse's organizational system was the difference between a successful code and a fatal delay. Nobody would notice the quality of her work. That was fine. The people who noticed were the people who understood the stakes, and those people weren't running the night shift reorganization system at St. Michael's Hospital. What they didn't know was what it cost her. The careful blankness. The acceptance of Mercer's small cruelties without so much as a breath change. The way she'd learned to compress an entire previous identity into the space between her heartbeats. 18 months of disappearing. 18 months of a name that belonged to someone else now. 18 months of a folded flag sitting in her locker like a secret. She was back down the stairs by 1:30 a.m. The ICU was quieter now, that liminal quality that hospitals owned in the deepest part of the night, when the dying either decided to stabilize or decided they were finished. Mercer was gone. The colonel was sleeping. Katie moved to her locker at the end of the break room, the small steel box that belonged to her and only her, and opened it to the precise order of her second life. 2 extra scrubs. A pair of shoes. A water bottle. And beneath the scrubs, wrapped in plastic, the folded flag. Service dress uniform. 13 folds. The one from her teammate, from the one she couldn't save, from the explosion in the Jolan district that had ended the person she was supposed to be. She didn't take it out. She never took it out where anyone could see. Just let her hand rest on it for a moment through the plastic, through the cloth beneath, feeling the shape of something that was supposed to be dead and buried. Something that was supposed to stay buried. The locker door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. Her shift had 12 more hours. The Colonel was stable. Dr. Mercer would be back at dawn, ready with his sharp voice and his sharper eyes, already working through scenarios where he could prove that someone with transcripts from a community college had no business in a level 1 trauma center. Katie moved back to the ICU and settled into the rhythm of it. Monitoring. Charting. The small acts of invisible expertise that nobody recognized until someone died because it wasn't there. At 3:47 a.m., the monitor in room 347 registered a change. Not an alarm. Not an emergency. Just the small fluctuation that meant something in the Colonel's body was adjusting to recovery. Katie checked it from the nurse's station, read the data the way other people read faces, and understood that whatever had happened to this man in Kandahar, whatever had brought him to this hospital and this floor and this room 47 doors from her shift desk, she would be watching. She would notice. She would be ready. That was what the flag meant. That was what 18 months of disappearing meant. That was what the careful blankness and the accepted insults and the compression of her entire previous existence into the space between one breath and the next meant. You didn't survive a war just to stop surviving when the war ended. Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her in front of 12 attending physicians at 0800 hours, projecting her community college transcripts onto the surgical theater screen like she was a cautionary tale instead of a human being. The words hung in the air of the amphitheater, antiseptic and cold and deliberate. Katie Rodriguez stood at the front of the surgical team, positioned exactly where he wanted her, and she didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't let the heat climbing her neck show on her face. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know that the woman standing in front of them had kept men alive on a mountain in Bagram with nothing but a tourniquet and muscle memory. The truth walked into St. Michael's every morning wearing blue scrubs and a blank expression, and nobody saw it. But that wasn't the worst part. Grand rounds started the way they always did, Dr. Mercer commanding the surgical theater like it was his personal kingdom, which, in his mind, it was. The man was 58, silver-haired, educated at Johns Hopkins and groomed by 30 years of hospital politics into believing that credentials were character. His power source was institutional, which made him nearly unstoppable inside these walls. He had chief of surgery in his corner. He had the board's ear. He had cultivated the kind of reputation where residents scrambled to praise him in the hallways because one whispered word from Dr. Mercer could end a career before it started. Katie had learned to navigate his moods the way soldiers navigate minefields, careful, methodical, invisible. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, and the entire surgical team straightened. 15 doctors. 3 attending physicians. 6 residents. And Katie, standing slightly apart from the group, her hands clasped behind her back. This morning's case presentation includes an exceptional teaching moment about clinical oversight. He clicked to the next slide. Katie's community college transcript appeared, magnified, projected across a screen large enough that the audience in the back row could read her grades individually. His voice took on the tone of a disappointed parent explaining why a child had failed. Our hospital's hiring practices have become increasingly flexible. This is what happens when we lower our standards to fill positions. He gestured at the projection without looking at her. Tell me, Rodriguez. Can you even spell vancomycin, or do you need picture instructions? The silence was the kind that exists in operating rooms just before the surgeon makes the first incision, expectant, held breath, the fluorescent light seeming to lean closer to hear the answer. One of the residents, a 4th year named Phillips, looked at his shoes. The attending physician from cardiothoracic, Dr. Hayes, shifted his weight and studied the ceiling with sudden, intense focus. Katie's jaw tightened. Just for a moment. Just enough that if someone had been watching, really watching, the way a combat medic learns to watch for the smallest physiological change, they would have seen the lateral pterygoid muscle contract. But her voice, when she spoke, came out steady and even. Vancomycin, doctor. Vancomycin. Mercer smiled. The smile wasn't warm. The smile was the smile of a man who'd been handed exactly what he wanted, proof that he was right, that she was lesser, that the entire room should witness her humiliation and understand the natural order of things. He turned back to the slides, dismissing her with the same gesture he'd used to dismiss her educational history. Let's move on. I trust you can manage the vending machine without consulting a pharmaceutical reference guide. The group filed out of the amphitheater, and Katie remained in the back row until the last resident had passed her. She could feel Phillips glancing over his shoulder, and she knew what would happen next. She'd learned this pattern by noon on her first day at St. Michael's. The vending machine was on the third floor, near the staff break room, positioned in that fluorescent-lit hallway where the afternoon shift mingled with the lingering morning crew. Katie pressed the button for black coffee at 1,247 hours because that was always when the machine worked fastest, when the coil mechanism didn't jam, and because routine was survival. The coffee dropped. She collected it. She was turning to leave when she heard the laughter. "Picture instructions," Philip said to his colleague, Dr. Roman, a second-year resident who'd been in grand rounds. "Did you see her face when he asked about vancomycin?" "I heard she got her degree from a cereal box," Roman responded, and both men laughed like it was the most original joke ever told. Katie walked past them without breaking stride. Her face showed nothing. No embarrassment. No anger. No crack in the surface. She'd trained for this in a different context, in a different life, learning to move through hostile spaces without triggering the predators inside them. That skill had just been repurposed, which was not the first time in her career that combat training had found civilian applications. Her coffee was hot. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate elevated by maybe 8 beats per minute, which was discipline, not fear. But the social destruction had momentum now. By evening, the residents' jokes had circulated through the ICU nursing staff like an infection. By the next morning, the story had evolved. Katie hadn't just needed picture instructions, she'd called a medication by the wrong name 3 times last week. She'd nearly contaminated a sterile field. She'd asked what antibiotics were. The stories weren't true. The stories weren't even close to true. But truth was irrelevant when the narrative had already been written by someone with institutional authority. Dr. Mercer reviewed medication orders from the ICU at 0635 the next morning, his coffee untouched because he was the kind of man who didn't need stimulants to feel alive. The stimulation came from the work itself, from the precision of his control. Katie approached with her tablet, her steps measured, her voice low enough that only the doctors and nurses immediately nearby would hear. She'd caught something in the colonel's chart. His creatinine levels had shifted. The vancomycin dosage Mercer had prescribed was designed for normal renal function, and the colonel's kidneys were starting to struggle. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an emergency. But it was a mistake, and mistakes killed people, and Katie's hands had been trained to prevent mistakes. "Dr. Mercer, the colonel's vancomycin dosage should be adjusted for his renal function. His creatinine is elevated to 2.1. The current dose is..." He turned to her slowly. The nurse's station had gone quiet. Even the monitors seemed to pause in their beeping, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. "Are you practicing medicine without a license, Rodriguez?" His voice wasn't loud. That was the terrifying part. It was soft and measured and final, the way a judge's voice sounds when he's about to hand down a sentence. "Because if you continue to question my clinical decisions in front of my team, I will call security and have you escorted from this hospital. Do you understand me?" 3 nurses looked down at their charts with sudden, profound interest. The resident who'd been following Mercer on round stared at the wall. The colonel's monitor beeped once. Twice. The oxygen saturation holding steady at 94%, which was fine, which was normal, which meant nothing in the context of watching a man systematically dismantle someone who couldn't fight back. Katie's knuckles whitened around the tablet, the plastic casing warping slightly under the pressure. She nodded once. Understood. She turned and walked away before her composure could splinter, before the rage that lived underneath her careful mask could crack through the surface. Her hands shook as she set down the tablet at the nursing station, so she clasped them together. held them steady, reminded herself that she'd survived worse than humiliation. She'd survived Bagram. She'd survived the extraction. She'd survived the 18 months of erasure and nothing, of being officially dead in every system except the ones that still sent encrypted emails to her burner phone. She could survive this. She could survive anything that didn't involve bullets and IEDs. That afternoon, Dr. Mercer called the chief of nursing from his office, door closed, his voice measured and professional through the phone line. "I'm concerned about Rodriguez's competence. Multiple physicians have expressed concerns about her clinical judgment." He didn't mention that he was the only physician complaining. By evening, Katie's schedule had changed. She'd been moved to overnight shifts, where the ICU was quieter, where there were fewer eyes on her, where fewer people would witness whatever he planned next. Nurse Chen, the 30-year Navy veteran who'd actually defended Katie in a staff meeting 3 weeks ago, was reassigned to the surgical ward on another floor. The action was deliberate, precise, strategic. This was no longer simple bullying. This was professional assassination. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 3 in the morning, when Katie sat alone in the break room, her hands finally still, and pulled the folded flag from her bag. The flag that had arrived in a manila envelope 18 months ago with no return address. The flag that had draped the coffin of her teammate, her friend, the man who'd taken her position in the team rotation and never came home. She ran her fingers over the stars, tracing them in the dark, and the door opened. She shoved the flag back into her bag before the incoming nurse could see it. Her hands were steady again by the time she stood. His office door closed with a kind of soft finality that made doors closing matter. Dr. Mercer sat behind his desk, mahogany, imported, the kind that announced itself, and lifted his phone. The board member answered on the 3rd ring. Golf buddies didn't need pleasantries. "I need your ear on something sensitive," Mercer said, voice measured like a metronome keeping time. "We have a staffing situation. A nurse who's been falsifying credentials. Community college transcripts she's presented as something they're not. I'm concerned about patient safety. Very concerned. I'm documenting everything, but I wanted you aware before this escalates." The lie settled into the silence like sediment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power didn't shout. It whispered in the right ears and waited for the dominoes to fall. By 0700 hours the next morning, the assignments had changed. Sarah Chen and Marcus Washington, the 2 nurses who had defended Katie during rounds, who had quietly insisted her competence was obvious to anyone actually watching, found themselves reassigned. Chen to pediatrics 3 floors down. Washington to the night shift in the cardiac ICU. Not dramatic enough to trigger an HR complaint. Just a routine staffing rotation. The kind that happened all the time. The kind that isolated you from your allies and left you standing alone in a department where everyone suddenly looked away when you walked past. Katie saw it happen without it ever being explained. She simply worked the next shift and the familiar faces were gone. The new rotation posted on the break room bulletin board at 05:05. She read it while the coffee machine hissed steam into the antiseptic air like a small animal protesting. Her jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that the muscle flexed once, and she folded the paper and moved on. Mercer was escalating. Strategic now. Competent. He wasn't just insulting anymore. He was dismantling. The schedule itself became a weapon. Dr. Mercer had access to the master rotation because he was chief attending. He adjusted it so Katie's shifts no longer overlapped with Dr. Patricia Langford, the senior nurse practitioner who had worked trauma for 22 years and had quietly told Katie, "Don't listen to him. I've seen how you move. You know what you're doing. Gone." Mercer moved Katie to days when the department ran skeleton crews. When the attending was someone newer, still learning the hospital politics, still understanding that standing up for a junior nurse wasn't worth the career risk. The message was clear without ever being stated: you have no allies here. Not anymore. By Thursday, the restrictions came. Dr. Mercer flagged Katie's access to the electronic health record system. Ostensibly routine, some clinical staff didn't need direct access to all patient files, he explained to the IT director with perfect professional concern. It was better practice, really. Reduced liability. Katie could still work under the direct oversight of physicians, but she wouldn't be able to independently document clinical observations or request diagnostic imaging without his explicit approval. The IT director, a former Marine with a tattoo of the Eagle Globe and anchor on his forearm, looked at the request and said, "That's odd." Mercer smiled. Standard precautions for someone still developing their scope. The director nodded and processed it because Mercer outranked him in the hospital hierarchy, and you didn't fight those battles unless you were willing to lose them. The colonel's condition began to shift on Friday evening, subtle as a tilt in the horizon that only someone trained to notice would catch. Katie stood at the foot of his bed during her 1,900 rounds, watching his chest rise and fall. His breathing had changed, shallower, with a slight wheeze on the left side that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Combat trauma did this sometimes. The blast fragmentation that shattered his pelvis had missed his lungs by inches, but the concussive force rippled through tissue layers, and sometimes infection found its way into the spaces where inflammation had created weakness. She knew this. She had seen it in Bagram. She had treated it. His oxygen saturation read 94% on the monitor. Down from 98 this morning. His temperature was 37.8 Celsius, not high enough to trigger automatic alerts, just high enough to suggest his immune system was mounting a response to something his body recognized as wrong. Early sepsis. Pneumonia developing in the left lower lobe, she suspected. The kind of thing you caught early if you were paying attention, the kind of thing that became an airway crisis if you weren't. She documented everything. Not in the electronic health records where Mercer had restricted her access, but in a personal notebook she kept in her locker, a small leather-bound thing with cream-colored pages and a Delta Force insignia embossed on the cover that she had kept since Bagram. Her handwriting was precise, 0900 hours, 02 Sat 98, RR 16, Temp 37.1. 1900 hours, 02 Sat 94, RR 19, Temp 37.8. Breath sounds diminished left base. Possible early pneumonia. Recommend CXR and blood cultures. The words were ammunition she couldn't use. Evidence she couldn't present. Knowledge she was being legally prevented from acting on. She requested the chest X-ray anyway the next morning during rounds, standing at the foot of the colonel's bed with her hands clasped in front of her, the posture of deference of someone who understood hierarchy. Colonel's vitals suggest possible lower lobe pneumonia developing, she said quietly. Recommend imaging to rule out infiltrate. The room went quiet. 3 residents stood with their tablets and their pressed white coats, waiting to see what the attending would do. Dr. Mercer glanced at the colonel's chart on his tablet, took exactly 2 seconds, and looked back at Katie with an expression that could have curdled milk. The colonel is recovering appropriately, he said, voice pitched for the residents to hear. His oxygen saturation is adequate. His temperature is within acceptable parameters. What we have here is exactly the kind of unnecessary alarm I've been documenting, the incompetence masquerading as concern that happens when clinical training is insufficient. The words landed in the room like shrapnel. The residents made notes. The message was broadcasted, don't trust her judgment. She sees problems that don't exist. After rounds, Mercer caught her in the hallway outside room 347. His hand didn't touch her arm, but his presence did. Voice dropped to the register that made people listen even when they didn't want to. You will follow my care plan exactly, he said. Each word was a stepping stone across dark water. No suggestions. No adjustments. No independent thinking. If you cannot adhere to that standard, I will have you terminated today. Not tomorrow. Today. Do you understand me? Katie met his eyes. 3 seconds. Long enough to acknowledge what he was doing, that she understood the threat, that she recognized the orchestration. Her voice was steady as a surgical laser. I understand. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening at 2300 hours, she checked on the colonel one final time before the night shift took over. His breathing had deteriorated further. The wheeze was more pronounced now. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 92%, and his respiratory rate was elevated to 22 breaths per minute. His skin carried the faint sheen of someone's body fighting an internal battle it wasn't winning. She stood at his bedside for a full minute, weighing the orders she had been given against the knowledge burning behind her ribs, knowledge earned in Bagram, knowledge from holding dying soldiers together with her hands, knowledge from the moment when you chose between following protocol and saving a life. She adjusted his oxygen flow by 2 liters. Small. Quiet. The kind of adjustment a conscientious nurse made without announcing it. The machine hissed slightly as the oxygen percentage increased, the sound of air being forced through the cannula like a whisper that only she could hear. His saturation ticked upward almost immediately, 93, then 94, stabilizing as his lungs received what they needed to function. The colonel's eyes flickered open. His gaze focused on her face with the sudden clarity of someone recognizing something critical. "I know you," he whispered, the words rough as gravel. His hand moved slightly on the bed rail, reaching for something that might have been connection or memory. Katie shook her head once. "Rest, sir." She turned before he could say anything else, before the words that wanted to come out of his mouth could travel through the air and change things. Before Mercer, monitoring everything, could use that moment as another piece of evidence. She walked out of room 347 and didn't look back. But the colonel's eyes stayed open for another 15 minutes, watching the empty space where she had been, his jaw working as if he was trying to speak a name that lived only in classified files and buried operational records. And 3 floors down, in the darkness of the break room, Katie sat on a folding chair and pressed her hand against the scar tissue on her left shoulder, the one hidden under her scrubs, the one from the IED blast that was supposed to have ended her military career instead of just erasing it. The folded flag sat in her locker above her shoes, patient and waiting, the way flags always do. The chlorine smell of the hospital hit different at 2 in the morning. The night shift had that particular quality of silence, not peaceful, but waiting. Predatory. Katie moved through the corridors with the efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that motion was better than standing still, that purpose masked uncertainty. Her scrubs were damp from the endless cycle of fluids and sweat that marked the graveyard shift. She'd been awake for 17 hours straight, which meant her body was running on something deeper than caffeine. Something like muscle memory. Room 347 was dark except for the monitor's glow. The colonel lay motionless, his full lines dripping steady, his breathing shallow but regular on the ventilator. Katie had checked him at 0145. Everything normal. Everything predictable. Everything about to change in ways that would reshape the architecture of the hospital and the trajectory of her carefully constructed invisibility. The monitor's rhythm was her lullaby. She knew every tone, every cadence, every variation that signaled the difference between stable and crisis. At 0202, the alarm tone changed. Not the dramatic screaming of a code. Something worse. The slow, insistent wheeze of a patient whose oxygen saturation was climbing down a cliff he couldn't see coming. Katie's head came up before her conscious mind had registered the numbers. 78%. 74%. 70%. She was in the room before the second alarm fired. The colonel's eyes were open now, panic flooding his face, his hands clawing at the sheets. His chest rose and fell on the right side. On the left, nothing. Complete silence. The kind of silence that meant a lung had collapsed under pressure, pushing his heart and trachea sideways, strangling everything it touched from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was automatic, instantaneous. Her hands were already moving before she could think to move them. The crash cart was 6 steps away. For seconds. She grabbed the decompression kit, fingers finding the 14-gauge needle with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in dust storms, in the roar of helicopter rotors. The tray clattered. The syringe came free. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser, despite the adrenaline rewriting her nervous system at molecular level. Katie prepped the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were burned into muscle memory from training that officially didn't exist for someone who officially wasn't real. No time for sterile technique. No time for gloves. No time for anything except the fact that a man was dying in front of her and she was the only person on the floor who could stop it. The needle pierced skin with a soft resistance. 1 centimeter. 2. The tissue yielded like it always did, like bodies were designed to be saved if you knew where to push. The needle found the pleural space. The hiss of released pressure filled the room like a sigh from the earth itself. Air escaped, carrying with it the vacuum that had been suffocating the colonel's left lung. The sound was almost beautiful in its specificity. The sound of rescue. The sound of someone choosing to act instead of waiting. The monitor responded before the colonel did. 74. 82. 88. The oxygen saturation climbing like a rescue rope being thrown to someone drowning. His breathing deepened. The panic began draining from his face, replaced by the shock of someone who'd just been pulled back from the edge. 94%. Steady. The sinus rhythm was strong, climbing, stable. Katie called the code herself. Resident on the way. Attending informed. She documented everything while her hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the specific kind of physical aftermath that came from making life or death decisions in real time. She noted the needle decompression. The location. The time. 0204 hours. For minutes from crisis to stability. The colonel's eyes found hers as she worked. She didn't flinch from his gaze. She just continued, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 100 times in places that no longer officially existed on any map. The resident arrived at 0211, out of breath, already talking. Katie briefed him in 7 words. Spontaneous tension pneumothorax. Decompression successful. Stable. The resident looked at the colonel. Looked at the needle. Looked at Katie. His mouth opened and closed. He didn't say anything because what was there to say? She'd saved a life. That was the problem. Dr. Mercer reviewed the security footage at 0603 hours, standing in the dimly lit surveillance office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The footage showed everything in grayscale and time stamps. Katie moving into the room. The alarm. The immediate response. The needle. The hiss. The climbing saturation. The save. He watched it 3 times. His face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not gratitude. Not relief. Recognition. An opportunity had just landed in his lap, wrapped in the disguise of heroism. An unauthorized procedure. A community college nurse performing an invasive medical intervention that required licensure, experience, judgment. His judgment, not hers. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and he was going to use that crossing to erase her permanently. He picked up the phone at 0607. Called the board member who owed him a favor from a golf tournament in Hilton Head. Spoke with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to frame narrative as fact. I need to report a serious breach of protocol. Last night, our recovery room nurse performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient. A 14-gauge needle decompression. That's not her scope. He paused for effect. Her background is community college, Tom. We hired her when we should have hired someone board certified. This is exactly what happens when we compromise on credentials. He sent the security footage. Presented her transcripts. Spoke about liability, about insurance, about the hospital's vulnerability if this pattern continued. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply explained how a nurse with questionable qualifications had overstepped her authority in a way that could have killed the patient. How the fact that she'd saved the patient was almost worse, because it meant she might try it again. How confidence without proper education was a liability that walked on 2 legs and wore scrubs. By 0700, the narrative had shifted. By 07:45, the CEO had been briefed. By 1100, Katie was called to the HR office on the 3rd floor. 2 security guards were waiting outside the door, their presence announcing something worse than a conversation. The termination letter was already printed, already signed, already final. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who'd always been kind but was not kind now, handed it across the desk with a small, apologetic shrug. Gross overreach of duties. Unauthorized invasive procedure. Effective immediately. Katie read it once. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. There was nothing to say because any defense would require revealing things that couldn't be revealed. She simply nodded and stood. The guards escorted her to her locker without speaking. Courtesy, but absolute. The way security guards moved when they'd been instructed to be gentle about something irreversible. The locker smelled like antiseptic and the faint residue of 17 months of her presence. Katie pulled the box from underneath and began placing items inside with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to pack her entire life into something portable. The cracked mug that someone had given her on her first day, "World's okayest nurse," printed in fading letters. A dying succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves browning at the edges despite her best efforts at care. 12 shifts of careful watering couldn't save something that was determined to die anyway. And underneath, carefully wrapped in her winter jacket, the folded flag. The one that had arrived with a letter she wasn't supposed to receive, from a command structure that wasn't supposed to acknowledge her existence. The flag had belonged to Sergeant Marcus Halloway. Her best friend. Her spotter. The man who had died doing the job that used to be hers, in a location that didn't officially exist for a mission that had never happened. She carried the box through the lobby at 12:47 in the afternoon. Staff members averted their eyes the way people do when they witness something shameful. Someone had already spread the story. She'd performed an unauthorized procedure. She'd endangered a patient. She'd been fired. The hospital had protected everyone else by removing her. The narrative was clean and contained and let everyone pretend that merit meant something, that education mattered, that the wrong person had simply been identified and removed before she could do real damage. The rain started as Katie reached the bus stop, 2 blocks from St. Michael's. It fell in sheets, the kind of Georgia autumn rain that came sideways and found its way into everything. She stood with her cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching headlights blur past in the wet darkness. Her breath fogged in the cold. 7:32 in the evening. The hospital would be moving through shift change about now. Someone else would be monitoring room 347. Someone with credentials that couldn't be questioned would be handling the colonel's care. The system had rebalanced itself. The problem had been removed. Katie stood at that bus stop for 43 minutes, not moving, not thinking, just breathing in the rain and the diesel exhaust and the particular smell of Atlanta concrete when it was wet. She wondered if disappearing twice meant you were ever really there at all. If the first disappearance in Bagram, the erasing of Captain Catherine Rodriguez from every official record, was supposed to have made her invisible, then this one should have been easy. Just disappear again. Find work somewhere else. Become someone new. The bus pulled up at 8:15. She didn't get on. Instead, she walked back toward the hospital, carrying the box, not knowing why. Some part of her that still believed in something moved her feet through the rain toward the building she'd just been escorted out of. She stood in the parking lot outside the ER entrance, watching ambulances come and go, watching the organized chaos of people trying to save lives in a place that had just proven it didn't know what saving looked like. Water dripped from her hair. Her scrubs were soaked through. The flag was safe inside the jacket. That was what mattered. 3 days later, something nobody could have predicted would put everything in motion. Something that would bring uniforms to the hospital lobby. Something that would make Dr. Mercer's strategic dismantling look like the calculation of a small man playing chess against an opponent whose entire board he couldn't see. But that night, in the parking lot rain, Katie just stood there, waiting for something she didn't have a name for, carrying the remnants of a life that had never officially existed. The box grew heavier. The rain fell harder. And somewhere in room 347, the colonel slept the sleep of a man who knew exactly who had saved him. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. 3 days passed before St. Michael's routine background check flagged something that shouldn't exist in a civilian nurse's file. A classified security clearance embedded in Katie Rodriguez's social security number. The kind that triggered automatic Pentagon notification. The kind that made hospital administrators pale when they saw the red flag stamp on their screens. By Wednesday morning, the hospital's lobby began to fill with uniforms. They came in formation. Not tactical, not aggressive, just purposeful. 2 Marine MPs in dress blues. A Navy officer with command insignia. And then the one who made the entire atrium go silent, a 2-star general whose presence seemed to compress the air itself, moving through automatic doors like a man accustomed to institutions rearranging themselves around him. His shoes clicked on marble tile with the sound of authority itself. 1, 2, 3, 4. The colonel was waiting in his wheelchair near the surgical wing, his pelvis still healing, his left leg immobilized, but his eyes sharp as a combat lens. He'd been discharged 3 days after Katie saved his life, transferred to Walter Reed for specialized rehabilitation. He'd been there exactly 47 hours before he made a single phone call to someone who owed him a favor. Now he was back. His jaw tightened when he saw Katie step out of the elevator on the 3rd floor, holding a stack of patient charts, still unaware. She was already moving past him when the colonel's voice cut through the hallway corridor noise, not loud, not panicked, just a single word that froze every veteran within earshot. Viper. The name hung in the air like a detonated charge. Katie's hand stilled. The chart sagged against her chest. She turned slowly, deliberately, her eyes meeting the colonel's with the kind of recognition that only comes when 2 people have survived something that kills most people who try. The officers moved like they'd trained for this exact moment. One positioned himself at the stairwell. Another took the elevator bank. The general continued forward, his dress uniform gleaming under fluorescent lights, 3 stars, and a row of medals that told a story of 40 years climbing the ladder of impossible decisions. Katie's composure didn't crack. It never did. But something shifted in her shoulders, a settling into a posture that had nothing to do with hospital protocol and everything to do with muscle memory older than her nursing license. Captain Rodriguez. The general's voice was pitched low, military quiet, the kind that doesn't need volume to carry across an entire institution. We need a word. The colonel's wheelchair squeaked as he angled it toward her. She saved my life. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Needle decompression at 0202 hours when I was drowning in my own blood. She knew exactly where to put it because she's seen that failure mode before. She's seen it in combat. A Marine Staff Sergeant stepped forward, carrying a leather case. He opened it with the kind of care you reserve for documents that cost lives to earn. His voice carried through the atrium, and nurses and residents stopped mid-stride to listen. Silver Star, Operations in Bagram Airfield, 2019. Citation reads, for gallantry in action while engaged with the enemy. Captain Rodriguez, then serving with 1st SFOD Delta, provided emergency field medical support under sustained fire, maintaining vital functions for 3 combatants with catastrophic wounds and coordinating medical evacuation for a downed airframe. Her actions under fire resulted in 3 soldiers returning to duty and prevented total combat loss of a critical asset. The silence was the kind you could operate in. Thick. Absolute. Nurses who'd spent months watching Katie absorb insults without flinching were recalibrating their entire understanding of her existence. Residents who'd heard Dr. Mercer's jokes about picture instructions were suddenly realizing they'd been mocking someone who'd been trained to keep people alive in conditions that would liquefy most human nervous systems. The general stepped closer. Katie didn't retreat. The 2 of them locked into a moment of perfect understanding, the kind that only happens between people who've held the same weight. Your classification was suspended following the Bagram operation, the general said quietly. Your records were scrubbed per protocol. 18 months you were supposed to disappear into a different life. Instead, you took a job as a nurse at a hospital in Atlanta where a Delta Force colonel with 80% pelvis fracture and a 3-day post-op fever thinks he's bleeding out into his own chest cavity at 0202 hours. The general's hand moved in a single, precise motion, a salute rendered with the kind of care you reserve for fallen comrades and miracles. His fist struck his chest once, sharp, definitive. "Welcome back, Captain." What happened next didn't silence the room. It collapsed the room into a different reality entirely. In the IT department, 3 floors below, Marcus Chen sat at his workstation nursing cold coffee and a justified anger. He'd been watching Dr. Mercer for 6 weeks. Not officially. Not with any authorization. Just with the kind of focused attention a brother devotes to the man who destroyed his sister's career trajectory. Marcus had been 17 when his sister Jessica joined the Navy. 23 when she transferred to St. Michael's Surgical Nursing Program. 31 when Dr. Mercer reassigned her from the unit where she'd been thriving, where she'd learned the real definition of competence from Katie Rodriguez, to a rotation in pediatrics where she was miserable and erased. Marcus had access to the hospital servers because he built the hospital servers. Every cable, every switch, every backup protocol was his handiwork. When Mercer started deleting emails, Marcus archived them. When Mercer altered the staffing schedule, Marcus timestamped it. When Mercer tried to erase the security footage of Katie performing the needle decompression, Marcus copied every frame to an isolated drive and encrypted it with a password that would take 3 lifetimes to crack. He walked to the CEO's office carrying a flash drive no larger than his thumb. Knocked once. Entered without waiting. "You need to see this," he said. 42 minutes later, the CEO was watching compilation footage with the hospital's legal counsel and a board representative. The timestamp on Katie's life-saving procedure was ironclad. The patient was in arrest. The resident was in the cafeteria. The attending was in another building. She had no choice. She had every choice. She did what you do when someone's dying in front of you, you save them. The footage of Mercer's phone call to the board member was captured with crystal clarity. She performed an unauthorized procedure. "We need to terminate immediately before the liability becomes institutional." The fabrication was smooth. Professional. Practiced. The CEO's face went very still. By noon, Dr. Mercer was escorted to the same conference room where Katie had been fired. The same table. The same chairs. Different script. Falsification of personnel records, the HR director said, reading from a template she'd never expected to use against the department's golden child. Abuse of authority. Harassment and systematic undermining of staff performance. Effective immediately, your medical privileges at St. Michael's are revoked. Your name will be reported to the State Medical Board. You have 30 minutes to collect personal items from your office. Mercer's face went the color of old marble. His Italian loafers, the expensive kind, leather from somewhere that required dead animals to stop caring about their own existence, clicked against tile as security walked him through the hallway. 3, 4, 5 times. Like a countdown. In the parking lot, he sat in his Mercedes for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. His phone began ringing. Piedmont Hospital calling. Emory calling. The entire Atlanta medical network, whispering before the ink dried on his termination. By evening, Dr. Mercer was uninsurable and untouchable. The supply van came 6 months later. Katie Rodriguez was running St. Michael's new veteran trauma program by then, funded by a Department of Defense grant, occupying the entire 4th floor, staffed by combat medics in transition and nurses who understood that some wounds don't show on scans. She wore captain's bars on her hospital ID now. The Pentagon had released her from classification after her Silver Star ceremony made national news. Her picture had been in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in uniform, shaking hands with the governor, with a line beneath her name that finally told the truth: Captain Katie Rodriguez, Delta Force, retired. On a Tuesday morning in October, Katie was checking supply deliveries at the ambulance bay loading dock when the medical supply van rolled in. The driver wore a courier company uniform, cheap polyester that hung wrong on a frame that used to fit Italian loafers. Dr. Mercer didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. But later that morning, when Katie returned to her office and opened her locker, her hand found the folded flag, the one from her teammate who'd carried it last, who'd carried it until the day a buried IED made carrying anything impossible. Her fingers traced the stars. Smooth. Faded. Sacred. Nurse Chen, Marcus's sister Jessica, reassigned back to the trauma unit on day 1, brought her coffee. Jessica's hands were steady now. Happy, even. Jessica knew who'd made that possible. "You okay, Captain?" Jessica asked. Katie nodded. "Always." In the ICU that afternoon, a young Marine corpsman on his first civilian rotation froze during a code. His hand started shaking. His training scattered like spent brass. His nervous system screaming that something was wrong and he couldn't fix it and people were dying. Katie stepped beside him. Her voice dropped into that register that belongs only to people who've operated in chaos. "I've got you. Tell me what you see." She guided him through the save. His hand steadied. The monitor climbed. The patient went back into normal sinus rhythm. Afterward, in the break room, the young Marine asked her how she stayed so calm. Katie looked at the flag pin on her uniform collar. "Look back at him." Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that contains multitudes. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. He was military. He understood that sometimes the deepest truths don't need explanation, just recognition. Just knowing that someone beside you has stood in the dark and learned to see. If you're watching this, you already know that heroes don't always announce themselves. They show up. They do the work. They wait for the moment when the mask comes off and the world finally sees what they've always been. If Katie's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and had to prove who you really are, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Drop a comment. Have you ever been judged wrong by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? Like this video and share it, because someone in your life needs to know that quiet strength is still strength. Thank you for watching.